When you think of Rio de Janeiro, what comes to mind? Perhaps it's Christ the Redeemer with open arms, Sugar Loaf Mountain at sunset, Copacabana Beach full of colorful umbrellas and people relaxing with a coconut water in hand. Images that look like they've come straight off a postcard, and in a way they have. But if there's one thing Bello Mundo does, it's show what lies beyond the surface. And just as we've shown the dark side of other places, this will be no different. Today we land in Brazil, more precisely in Rio de Janeiro, to take you on a tour of a side that doesn't appear in tourism advertisements. Number 1. The postcard image. What is Rio de Janeiro? From a world view, Rio is practically the definition of a postcard, a city that seems to have been designed to delight the eye of the beholder. It may have its problems, and we're going to talk about them, but first we need to understand what makes Rio so admired. And, let's be honest, Rio knows how to sell itself. It's almost a worldwide brand. Christ the Redeemer, the Sugar Loaf Mountain, the internationally famous beaches, and of course the girl from Ipanema who made the whole world sing bossa nova. It's a collection of symbols that not only represent Rio, but also the carioca vibe, that feeling of freedom, celebration, and natural beauty that the whole world wants to experience. And if there's one thing Rio knows how to do, it's party. Carnival is undoubtedly the biggest open-air show on the planet. In February, Sapucaí becomes the most vibrant stage in the world, with samba schools parading in a spectacle of colors, costumes, and music that mesmerizes Brazilians and foreigners alike. But Rio is not just about landscapes and parties. The gastronomy is second to none. The classic feijoada, which mixes tradition and flavor, is almost a ritual. There's also the famous Globo cookie with iced mate on the beaches of Copacabana and Ipanema, the caldinho de feijão served in the boteco, and so many other delicacies that have become part of the itinerary of those who visit the city. Rio de Janeiro breathes music, samba, funk, bossa nova. It doesn't matter what the rhythm, the relaxed way, and the ginga carioca make anyone want to tap their feet on the floor. It's the soundtrack of a city that refuses to stand still. And look, it's no exaggeration to say that Rio has even conquered Disney. Yes, the streets of Rio gave birth to Zé Carioca, the famous parrot full of swagger and mischief who became the greatest symbol of Brazil in the world of cartoons. And the most curious thing is that he was created by Walt Disney himself. Yes, Walt himself was in Brazil in 1941, and during his stay at the iconic Copacabana Palace Hotel, he came up with the idea of bringing to life this character who would capture the essence of the Carioca way. Zé Carioca's first official appearance was in the movie Hello Friends in 1942. The movie was divided into 4 parts, each showing aspects of South America. And of course, Brazil featured prominently. In the plot, Donald Duck arrives in Rio de Janeiro and is welcomed by Zé Carioca, who becomes a kind of tour guide. But, like any good carioca, Zé wasn't just going to show landscapes. He introduces samba, the famous promenade, and, surprise, even cachaça, the famous Brazilian drink. Together, Zé and Donald stroll around Rio to the sound of Tico Tico no Fubá, one of the most famous Brazilian songs of the time. But at the same time, this city hides very serious problems, some literally behind these beautiful landscapes, and that's what we need to talk about. Number 2. Noble neighborhoods and slums side by side. If there's one thing that shocks anyone who arrives in Rio de Janeiro for the first time, it's the absurd contrast between luxury and necessity. On the one hand, modern buildings, millionaire apartments, and tree-lined streets. On the other, entire hills full of houses piled up, almost balancing on top of each other. It looks like a movie set, but it's the reality of Rio. And we're not talking about distant neighborhoods or remote outskirts. Here, the social abyss is literally side by side. The most emblematic example of this is the Rocinha favela. It is not only the largest favela in Rio de Janeiro, but also a symbol of this contrast. Located less than 6 kilometers from Leblon, one of the most expensive areas in the city, Rocinha is a living representation of the social abyss that defines Rio de Janeiro. Just cross a few streets and you're out of one of the city's most expensive areas, and straight into Brazil's largest favela. But don't think that this is a peculiarity of Rocinha alone. In Rio de Janeiro, this logic is repeated throughout the city. There are more than 1,000 favelas scattered throughout the hills, where around 1.5 million people live, which represents around 22% of Rio's population. Yes, 1 in 5 Rio residents lives in a favela. And if you think that the emergence of these favelas was a geographical coincidence, forget it. This story has an origin that few people know about. And strange as it may seem, France has everything to do with it. Number 3. The origin of the favelas. The favelas of Rio de Janeiro didn't just appear out of nowhere. They have deep roots in the history of a city that tried at all costs to become the Paris of the tropics. At the beginning of the 20th century, Brazil was experiencing the fervor of the newly proclaimed republic and was preparing for the centenary of its independence. Rio, the country's capital, needed to impress the world. And what was the model of inspiration? Paris, of course. The urban reform of Paris, led by Georges-Eugène Haussmann at the behest of Napoleon III, was a revolution. Between 1853 and 1870, narrow streets and old buildings gave way to wide boulevards, modern buildings, and a sewage system that is still praised today. But this spectacle of modernity came at a very high social cost. Thousands of people were evicted from their homes with no alternative housing. And it was exactly this formula that Brazil tried to copy, with an even more dramatic result. In 1903, then Mayor Pereira Passos, with the support of President Rodrigues Alves, began a major urban reform in Rio. The aim was clear: to erase the city's colonial image, open up wide avenues, modernize the infrastructure, and create an environment that would impress the international elite. But for that, one detail was needed: to remove the people who lived in the center. And that's how the tenements, which were houses divided into small rooms rented out to poor families, were demolished. The residents, without compensation or any kind of support, were evicted overnight. With no alternatives, these people migrated to the hills and outskirts close to the center. This is how the first favelas began to appear. And if you think that's the end of the story, you're wrong. Because, as if exclusion and the push to the slums weren't enough, the emergence of the favelas brought with it a new problem. A problem that, to this day, defines everyday life in Rio and makes the headlines: organized crime. Number 4. Organized crime. If there's one thing everyone has heard about Rio de Janeiro, it's the noise that never stops. But this time, we're not talking about music or samba. Gunfire, police operations, and faction disputes are part of the ambient sound of those who live in the favelas. And don't think that this is the stuff of soap operas or sensationalist news. This is the daily reality for thousands of people. But what few people ask themselves is, how did Rio get to this point? Remember how we said that favelas began to appear when workers with no alternative climbed the hillsides and built their makeshift homes? That's right. In the beginning, these places were just humble homes. But things began to change in the 1970s. It was at this time that drug trafficking entered the favelas, and the fuse came from an unlikely place, the Ilha Grande prison. During the military dictatorship, political prisoners were placed with common criminals. It may seem like a simple administrative decision, but the result was devastating. The political prisoners were taught tactics of discipline, hierarchy, and organization. The criminals learned quickly and used this knowledge outside their cells. What was once just a gang became something much more powerful: criminal factions. That's when the names that everyone knows today emerged: Comando Vermelho, Tercero Comando, and other groups that, in the beginning, were just local gangs. Over time, they became real paramilitary organizations. They controlled territories, managed drug trafficking, and imposed their own laws within communities. And the scenario only gets worse. Number 5. Crime waves. When it comes to urban violence, Rio de Janeiro is always at the top of the global rankings, and not in a good way. Numbeo, one of the largest data platforms on safety and quality of life, placed Rio in 4th place among the most dangerous cities in the Americas. That's right, more dangerous than Los Angeles, Bogota, Cancun, and even Medellin, a city that, for years, was the biggest symbol of violence on the continent. If that wasn't enough, the numbers of shootings reveal the seriousness of the problem. Between July 2016 and July 2017, more than 3,800 shootings were recorded in Rio's communities. That's an average of 319 shootings a month. That's practically one shooting a day. And believe me, the situation hasn't improved since then. According to the Fogo Cruzado Institute, which monitors gunfire, the scenario has become even more tense. From January to October of 2024, 2,165 shootings were recorded in the metropolitan region of Rio. Of this total, 795 occurred during police operations, i.e., clashes between the police and criminal factions. And if you think that the problem is only in the favelas, reality shows otherwise. Most of these deaths did not take place in hidden alleys. Some of the most shocking scenes took place right in the heart of the city. One of the most striking cases was the murder of 3 orthopedic doctors on Barra de Tijuca Beach, one of Rio's wealthiest and busiest neighborhoods. But the city's reputation for violence is not only due to drug trafficking. Number 6. Trafficking, militias, and the complex web of crime. If you think that the biggest problem of violence in Rio de Janeiro comes only from drug trafficking, you're very much mistaken. Because in addition to the factions that dominate the favelas, there is another power that is growing quietly: the militias. These groups don't appear armed with rifles in the middle of the streets. They control the shadows, and that's where the danger lies. Unlike drug traffickers, militias don't need to show their weapons all the time. They infiltrate everyday life, control services, and run the day-to-day lives of those who live in the communities. Sounds like an exaggeration? Then pay attention. The militias sell gas cylinders, charge protection fees, control the clandestine cable TV signal, and even the internet that reaches homes. If you live in an area controlled by militias, you only buy gas and internet from those they tell you to. You have no choice, and don't think that they act alone. They also control political power. Several politicians have already been identified as allies or financed by militia members. That's right. They finance campaigns and then pay them back. And here's an important detail. The militias not only dominate the streets, but also the political seats. If you've seen Elite Squad 2, then you know what we're talking about. In the first movie, the focus was on the war between BOP and drug trafficking. But in the second, the militia's scheme was laid bare. It wasn't just a movie script, it was a portrait of reality. Now, don't think that drug traffickers and militias live in peace, each in their own corner. These two worlds also clash. Militias and factions vie for control of entire communities. It's like two armies trying to conquer the same territory. And when that happens, what are the residents left with? Fear and despair. And believe me, this war is not new. Since 23, the Comando Vermelho has been attacking communities that were controlled by militias. But this invasion isn't just about taking territory. After the group wins comes the cleansing, and that means hunting down relatives, friends, and anyone connected to the defeated group. The cycle of violence never ends. And then there's gambling, a clandestine lottery with decades of history, involved in kickback schemes, relationships with politicians, and corrupt police officers. And then we come to the part that many people don't like to talk about: police corruption. Without it, none of this would be possible. Many of the actions of factions, militias, and the gambling only happen because there is someone on the other side turning a blind eye, and sometimes not for free. This has been shown very well in films and even in international productions, such as Fast and Furious 5, where a bandit is protected inside Rio's military police complex. But do you think it's over? Of course not. Have you ever heard of Dragnet? Number 7. Dragnet. If there's one thing that makes anyone panic in Rio de Janeiro, it's the famous Arrastão. Everyone has heard of it, and unfortunately, many have seen it up close. The Dragnet has no time or place. It can happen on the beach, on the bus, on the subway, and more recently, even in the middle of traffic. For those who don't know, a dragnet is when a group of people, usually young people or teenagers, get together to rob several people at the same time. They attack quickly, creating panic and grabbing cell phones, purses, wallets, and everything else in sight. One of the most recent examples took place on Brazil Avenue, one of the busiest avenues in Rio de Janeiro. At the end of November, during rush hour and with traffic at a standstill, criminals stopped the flow of traffic and started robbing drivers one by one. People were trapped inside their cars with nowhere to run, watching the thieves take everything. But why does this happen? The explanation isn't so simple, but everyone knows that social inequality plays an important role. On the one hand, people with expensive cell phones and designer watches. On the other, young people growing up in communities where schools, jobs, and opportunities are lacking. When the state doesn't do its part, crime does. Number 8. Corruption, public policies, and difficult change. And now comes the question that everyone asks, but almost no one answers. Why is it so difficult to improve the situation in Rio de Janeiro? The answer again isn't simple, but it has a name that always comes up: corruption. It's everywhere, draining resources that should go to education, health, transportation, and housing. Politicians, business people, and even members of public security end up involved in this cycle. It's a game of interests where, in the end, it's the population that loses out, caught between the cross and the sword. Some people compare Rio to a chronic patient. It has potential, it has everything to recover, but it needs a long and serious treatment. The problem is that the medicine never arrives in the right dose. The major sporting events, such as the World Cup and the Olympics, brought some improvements, and it seemed that the future was arriving for everyone. However, without policies of continuity and a lack of control over corruption, Many of these initiatives were lost in time. Works remained unfinished, transportation stations were scrapped, and the feeling of change dissolved into thin air. And then we come back to the initial question. What is Rio de Janeiro? Is it a tropical paradise or a city marked by violence and inequality? The answer is that Rio is two things at once. It's the land of incredible landscapes, sunsets at Arpoador, samba, and crowded beaches. But it's also home to slums with no sanitation, drug trafficking, militias, corruption, and fear. If you're thinking of visiting Rio, go and enjoy the best Rio has to offer. But understand that behind the samba on the sidewalk, there are invisible people battling every day for the basics. Because Rio de Janeiro is not a Hollywood movie with a predictable ending. Here, the plot changes all the time. If you enjoy this journey, stick around, subscribe to Bello Mundo, turn on notifications, and follow our next explorations of fascinating destinations and impressive lifestyles. Thanks for your company, and see you on our next adventure.